Je vais rapidement présenter Jessica Gerschultz, qui est professeure associée, c'est ça, en histoire de l'art au département Afrique et Afrique-Amérique à l'université du Kansas, pardon, du Kansas. C'est pas pareil du tout. Kansas, donc, et qui a, comme vous le savez, publié un livre en 2019 qui est là, Decorative Arts of the Tunisian École, un très beau livre avec une étude assez intéressante et qui traverse plusieurs questions qui touchent à l'histoire de l'art en Tunisie à travers différentes évidemment, disons, une lecture assez particulière, quand même tournée vers les arts de la fibre, essentiellement. Et on pourra faire circuler le livre pendant que Jessica nous présente le livre, donc, pour le consulter, le feuilleter. Donc, on va le faire passer maintenant. Je ne crois pas. Yes, voilà, ok, tant mieux. Je vais prendre mon exemplaire tout de suite alors, avant qu'il disparaisse. Donc, je vais laisser Jessica donc, présenter son livre. Et ensuite, il y aura une discussion donc, qui va être menée par Beya Othmani, qui est curatrice et chercheuse, et qui s'interroge ou questionne l'histoire des expositions en Tunisie essentiellement. Et donc, je pense que vous avez beaucoup de choses déjà en commun à échanger. Et je cède la parole à Jessica. Merci Jessica d'être venue.
Okay, can you hear me? All right, thank you very much for the introduction, and I would like to thank 30 Bis, Mohammed Ali, for inviting me here today. And there are so many people here who I am indebted to. I would like to thank, firstly, the co-sponsors of the event, the Centre d'études maghrébines à Tunis and the Mellon Foundation Fellows Program. I would like to thank the Center for Middle East Studies office in Tunisia of Harvard University. And I would like to thank Beya Othmani, whose images populate this book. I would like to thank the families of artists and the artists themselves who are present in the audience. I would like to thank Larissa Shomiak and Bill Granera, Mohammed Ali, Beya Othmani, who I am absolutely thrilled will be here. Nadia Jalasi, Aisha Fileli, Aisha Gorji, Dr. Balagha, people who have encouraged me and offered their support over the years. I am grateful to you. I would like to thank all of you in the audience for coming here on a Friday afternoon. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, and I'm best at presenting in English, so I appreciate your patience with that. I have a couple copies of the book that are circulating around. I will sell a few copies after the talk, and I also will maybe put out a piece of paper. If you want to leave me your email address, if you would like to have a PDF, I will gladly email you a PDF. But please don't post it online because I'm probably not supposed to do that. So let me begin. I'll speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have a discussion. So this is a book that's a story about Tunisia as a site of aesthetic inquiry, and it's equally a foray into the fabrication of modernism from the standpoint of artists based in an ex-colonial country. I focus on the 1950s and 60s and investigate how artists of the Tunisian école grappled with the question of the artist as craftsperson or the artist-artisan, and how they sought to ennoble art forms that were formerly classified as indigenous craft in the French protectorate. These artists navigated a system of artistic training and patronage that was interwoven with Tunisian socialism and state feminism in the 60s, and notably the uplifting of women artists. And they created numerous decorative programs and public murals that dramatized the symbolism of handcraft and artistic labor. The monumental tapestries and the ceramic tile panels of artists and professors such as Safia Farhat and Abdelaziz Gorgi, which were created in collaboration with expert weavers and artisans like Habibadullah and Nasr Slama, epitomize this corpus of decorative art. And the book uses the feminized concept of the decorative as an analytic category to examine asymmetrical relationships and artists' attempts to reimagine artistic and social hierarchies. Counter to dominant art historiography, which has largely reinforced a narrative that privileges male painters, I argue that so-called artisanal and decorative materials, forms, and figures played a pivotal and, if momentary, role in the articulation of modernism here in Tunisia and beyond. And like the book, I will begin today with a vignette of the Gallery Les Métiers, and then I will sketch a few major threads that are examined across the 6 chapters that you can see here. So chapter 1 opens with 2 quotes. The first is by the late Latifa Ben Abdullah, and the second is by Safia Farhat, who I will return to later in this presentation. And I would like to take a moment to dedicate this event to Latifa, who tragically lost her life a few weeks ago. I was hoping she would be here. Her support for this project, her encouragement, and her generosity over the years were invaluable. And my time and my conversations with her are among the treasured gifts in life. Latifa was certainly a source of inspiration for the many people whose lives she touched, and most famously her husband, Jalal Ben Abdullah. And her contributions to modern art, design, and fashion in Tunisia are immeasurable. In 1967, Latifa was interviewed by an unnamed reporter in L'Action, and the writer notes that she herself is an artist and not simply the wife of an artist. And when asked questions about beauty and taste, Latifa said, quote, "In Tunis, people think that they need enormous resources to furnish, and it's absolutely false. A few small things suffice to give an interior a personal note, and there are so many beautiful things here. To go searching for flashy gilding and frills of ugly copies that come to us from Europe, that is a mistake." Latifa's critical observation echoed the voices of critics like Hatem al-Mekki, and their writings about the interface of art, craft, and design signaled an important shift in approaches to medium, and this, in which formerly elevated paintings above art forms that were historically produced in Tunisia, like hand-woven textiles, ceramics, silk-painted scarves, and other decorative objects. So a few years earlier, in 1958, al-Mekki had praised the painted scarves of Jacqueline Gilbert Bilaga for their artistic merit. And he wrote, quote, "But these squares, above all, resemble a real painting, well composed and rhythmic, in turn happy and enchanting, light and elusive. There's the sea and the sand in these modest cuts of silk. Whether screens, panels, or scarves, even necklaces, the objects of Jacqueline Bilaga belong to the domain of the simple and the marvelous, and it is not a mirage, it is great art," end quote. Al-Mekki's review elicits the fluctuating value system that a group of Tunis-based artists sought to reconcile as they expanded their repertoire beyond easel painting. In their aesthetic deliberations, they investigated the materials and the processes of the artisanat. And these same artists also queried European-derived hierarchies that had privileged painting over the artistic practices that are often described in dominant art history as sort of indigenous or decorative or Islamic. These feminized categories had colonial connotations of being mindless, naive, and repetitious in the early 20th century, and they captured ever-shifting ideas about labor, gender, and class over the years. In 1960, Jacqueline Bilaga and her husband, the École de Tunis artist Ali Bilaga, opened a gallery in Tunis called Les Métiers with the objective of uniting artisanal production and modern art. And it was in the archives of Ali Belagha that I really was inspired to take on some of these questions. The desire to transcend an art-craft binary was informed by colonial theories of art and culture that were continuously reinterpreted by artists and officials associated with the early post-colonial government of Habib Bourguiba. Les métiers sold objects that ranged from Jacqueline's silk scarves, clothing, and ebony jewelry, to ceramic ware, stone boxes, spoons, and gilded jasmine flower buds. And Latifa Ben Abdullah was a model for Les Métiers, and she was seen here wearing and modeling Jacqueline's jewelry. And these photos are not in the book, but I would love to write an article about some of their collaborations in the future. The Belaghas imagined their production line as dismantling colonial hegemonies of art and infusing the artisanat with creativity and originality, which were qualities that some mid-century administrators perceived as lacking among ordinary artisans. And the two artists inventoried materials that were historically used by Tunisian artists, and you can see them listed in the invitation card: clay, silver, plant fiber, wood, ceramics, wax, and lace. In conceptualizing the mission of Les Métiers, Jacqueline stated, quote, "We wanted to draw from traditional forms to pull out modern forms, and it was useless to copy and to plagiarize old models, and necessary to use the past and maintain a close connection to the present," end quote. And in addition to their extensive personal research, they employed dozens of artisans whose expertise in historical materials and processes really inspired Ali Belagha, who sometimes called himself an artisan. And he addressed the practical and beneficial dimensions of recruiting artisans to work for them, saying that we touch on all forms of the Tunisian artisanat, and more than 25 families live from the outlet that we've offered, not counting the number of artisans who work on pieces by commission and outside of their regular occupations. So Les Métiers received an elite clientele of upper-class Tunisians, diplomats, and tourists, and certainly the state-run tourism industry of the 60s commissioned their elegant wares for hotels and boutiques, integrating artistic production with the economic plan and the social agenda that was driving, in part, socialism and artisanal renewals. Mirroring practices that were explored in the Beaux-Arts, the École des Beaux-Arts, the Belaghas used the objects and decor of Tunisian dwellings as a touchstone for modern design. And this genre of decorative objects then appeared in murals and tapestries over the years as artists replicated and animated artisanal motifs and themes into monumental formats, often with the assistance of artisans who were specialized in ceramics, mosaics, stone carving, ironwork, and weaving, and who created their own meanings for the works that they helped to execute. The establishment of Les Métiers in 1960 foretold the large-scale artistic collaborations and some of the institutional changes in Tunis in the following 10 years, which was the development decade. And while many artists in this study were trained as painters, it's to their explorations of material and medium that I've turned to recuperate an elusive and gendered history of artistic collaborations in labor. So this book focuses on a loose configuration of artists, artisans, and art students that I've called the Tunisian École, and certainly this comprises of the École de Tunis, who doesn't need an introduction here, a group of Tunisian, French, and Italian artists, the École des Beaux-Arts, which was an institution that had historically emphasized the preeminence of painting in the colonial period, and then the National Office of the Artisanat, which during this period began to employ about 80% women, and so it was increasingly feminized. And I'll speak to that just a little bit before turning back to the murals. Weaving practices at mid-century were considered to embody the cultural signifiers of traditions, and they served as a springboard for modernizing labor and artistic production. It's historically conducted in domestic spaces, fiber and loom preparation, and the act of weaving encoded in the very materials and production processes, women's ritual and symbolic practices. but these were practices that came to represent a foundational set of traditional values that first the French and later some in the administration of Bourguiba sought to modernize. And the edification of women was then linked to the cultivation of values associated with fine artists. And it is in this idealization that the act of creating art was seen as granting a new generation of women courage, creativity, and independence to mold a new social order across different social classes, and notably via collaborations between artists and artisans. And my other quote that begins the book is Safiya Farhat, who wrote about elevating women in an article in Faiza, and looking at women's traditional education. Safiya Farhat and Abdelaziz Gorgi, who were the art school's first Tunisian professors, are crucial links holding together the Tunisian école. And I am deeply indebted to Aisha Filali for her very important biography of Safiya Farhat, and to Aisha Gorgi as well, and I thank them both for their support of this research. Farhat and Gorgi supported an influx of female students at the École des Beaux-Arts, including Fela Kefi, whose archives were really valuable for me. And they elevated the position of both women and local Tunisian arts in the curriculum. So they really worked to change and support the study of Tunisian so-called decorative arts and ceramics. Gorgi employed Nasser Slema in his atelier of ceramics. He came from Nebel and was an expert who helped with the kiln. And some of their graduates went on to win prizes or to work for the artisanat as designers or managers. So for example, Fela Kefi won an office of state lands contest for a Beaux-Arts student to design a mural. This is the maquette that she still has in her home. And she also had won a prize for her work in the decorative arts and received a bundle of art history books from Bourguiba as part of this honor. And she, along with other artists of the École de Tunis, like Zubair Turki and Ali Belagha, collaborated with artisans that were skilled in historical mediums to create larger scale works. And in the book, I'll show only a few here, but in the book there are quite a few more, and there are many more photographs that don't appear in the book because I didn't have the space or the subvention. So let's turn to tapestry for just a moment. As a professor, Safiya Farhat took interest in Jean Leursat, who is a French tapestry artist who came to Tunis as a presidential guest. He came to advise the handcraft industry. Leursat praised the artisanat, but at the same time, he kind of reiterated some problematic assumptions in European art history. And he said, you know, the artisanat would not be able to advance unless artisans moved beyond the cycle of repetitive forms of Islamic tradition. And so he echoes predominant modernist tropes, and Leursat declared that an art that could not move with the times would cease to be an art, and that the artisanat was in need of artist designers trained in the Beaux-Arts. And what I found was so fascinating was the ways in which artists kind of took this advice but really subverted it, because they went on to collaborate in very different ways from the ways in which Jean Leursat himself tried to do tapestry. Farhat herself had already introduced the study of Tunisian art into the school, works that were often labeled decorative art or craft, and she partnered with the artisanat to bring women's expertise into the school. And she had, for example, installed weaving looms in her classroom and enabled students to learn directly from weavers, so students like Fatma Samet or Mohamed Njah. And she kind of builds on a platform that Pierre Bouchel initiated in the 1950s. And when I was in Aubusson in France, I found a series of letters between Pierre Bouchel and Jean Leursat about the introduction of tapestry as a medium to Tunis. And Bouchel used some of these exchanges as the basis for his first commissions for the 1% law. And so these were artworks that were originally installed in buildings as part of a post-Second World War reconstruction effort. Many buildings, as you know, were bombed in the war, and there was an effort to decorate buildings, and Bouchel and Yahya Turki had written to the French resident general in the late 1940s about offering commissions as a way to help support the arts. And this law allocated 1% of a building's budget to its decor, and it was also supported by like Jacques Marmy, who was the founder of the architecture program at the Beaux-Arts, who was on the committee. Despite the fact that Laursat himself is very well known in France and beyond, Bouchel's proposal of a tapestry was mocked by the architect when he was putting together the program for the Lycée de Carthage. And I was looking at the unpublished memoirs of Franz Bouchel, who was his second wife, in which Sebag was saying that, well, you know, we don't want a tapestry in the school. It's quote unquote a type of curtain, and you know, the mocking kind of goes on and on. So the association of fiber arts and modern art is a tenuous one in art history. So painted, let's see. So between 1950 and 1978, artists of the Tunisian École designed and they created dozens of decorative programs for state offices, schools, hotels, factories, and palaces under the so-called 1% law. And I was able to document many of these works and also used photographic archives, notably in Beya Othmani, to recuperate and then study what the artists were depicting. And then in the post-colonial regime, they reinstated the law in '62, and artists directed many of the commissions, which not only included the painting of murals, but also the manufacture, again, of tapestries, ceramic panels, stone obelisks, low-relief friezes. And I used, again, archival and photographic records and other secondary sources to try to photograph most of them. So through this genre of monumental work and related aesthetic investigation, the Tunisian École both shaped and critiqued a system of state support that aimed to elevate the intellectual, economic, and social mores of the common Tunisian, or the laborer, the gendered artisan, and most frequently the female weaver. And so I was looking at images of the weaver that seemed to appear everywhere as sort of the symbol of the average laborer who was deemed in need of social and psychological transformation to be able to cope with the dramatic program of social and educational reform. And the space of the weaving loom, at least kind of when I was reading it, was that it had metamorphic potential. It was conceived as a site of transformation for the weaver, allowing her to contribute to modernist aesthetics and creative collaborations. And so then I started going back to these images, and I realized painted scenes constitute only a fraction of the decorative programs that were designed by the Tunisian École, and in fact monumental scenes were executed in artisanal materials, and they lend further depth to the imagery of labor in their materiality. And so looking at these works, I started to analyze the entire corpus. And many of the murals that I found the most powerful were created by Sophia Farhat, who conjured the class-based and gendered division of labor that's inherent to the production of art. And she evoked the feminized artisanat with her iconography. Triangular and zigzag motifs and shapes mirror those that are found in rural women's artistry, often textiles from the Gafsa region that had been sort of targeted in efforts for renewal by the tourism industry, but she's doing it in a very playful and interesting, critical way, and sort of animating and enlivening them. And so I believe that she speaks to sort of the labor and the ingenuity of women laborers and artisans kind of throughout. Textile motifs that were associated with women's labor, for example, fill the iconographic purview here and across other mediums. And certainly they comprise the content of this largest frieze executed in ceramic tiles for the exterior of the Sojoko factory. Bir Hassan is a textiles factory itself. So they can be seen as sort of self-reflexively engaging with the conditions of their own creation. And this is a decorative program that includes a wonderful stone obelisk that portrays a female spinner, designed by Gorgi. And it's very salient as women textile workers and artisans fabricated raw materials and wove manufactured textiles, and were the audiences who walked by these murals. So, again, thinking about fiber arts, they're associated with handicraft and with an artist's hands, and thereby with an artist herself and with her reception as artist. When her status is in question or her identity is obscured, and she becomes less visible. And my experience in the archives of the National Office of the Artisanat in Denden was very formative for my thinking about relationships of power in art history and in artistic production. I visited in 2014 and looked at some different photographs and documents housed in a warehouse that was adjacent to discarded metal tapestry looms and storage rooms where there were, at that time, heaps of unused fibers, even some dusty shelves and some dead birds, and I was kind of walking around, and it was rather eerie, and I felt like the dead birds had a fragility that really spoke to me about this silent space that had been formerly used for artistic production. And it made me think about the vulnerabilities of the documents and the life worlds that were enclosed in that space. And so, sort of despite the inattention to these archives, they conserved invaluable information about more anonymous, lower class women artisans and the feminized craft work that they were doing. And I looked at photographs of women's hands, which served as pedagogical and hiring aids in women's managerial training. And in contrast to sort of the signature styles of male artists who we often study in art history, I found that these hands really could stand for countless women who wove, and who wove for the artisanat. And at times I felt very touched to kind of study these aesthetics of a woman's hand. I found them to be beautiful, the contours, the pointed fingertips, the graceful demonstrations of agility, which are really the signature movements of feminine labor. And so, therefore, I started to think about multiple asymmetries in the art historical discipline and how they work together to suppress the feminine and the feminized, and this really coalesces in the textile medium. So again, in dominant Eurocentric art history, murals created in artisanal materials, which are often epitomized by the tapestry medium or by embroidery, represent a distinctly hybrid genre that scholars like Romy Golan have called an embarrassment to the master narrative of modernism, and certainly we have critics from the 50s like Clement Greenberg, and Louise Bourgeois, the artist, who wanted nothing to do with tapestry or fiber art. But yet, this was the very subject of many of the monumental works of the Tunisian École, and it's in these tapestries and decorative programs that we do see this imagery of textiles, weaving, and ceramics, often anthropomorphized, and as a corpus of artwork, they're very playfully self-referential. And the materiality, the iconography speak to their own creation. And so I found that they offered critical commentary on the walls of factories and schools, hotels and civic buildings. And sort of in conclusion, in the 53 years that Farhat first had her solo exhibition in 1970, I was reading a review where critics described her work as feminine and decorative. It seemed that she'd been subject to some marginalization, and not surprisingly so too were thousands of other artisans working in the feminized craft industry, despite the endorsement of the female weaver as the quintessential laborer to be uplifted, along with other agricultural, fishermen, producers, miners, who were sort of poised to benefit from reforms and who were the subjects of many of these murals. The decorative programs of the Tunisian École have been met with ambivalence, it seems. Some have been really well conserved, others have not. And the gendered scenes of labor and their iconography signal a nexus in which seemingly incongruous artistic genres and industries converged, but the interlacing sort of unraveled as the artworks materialized gender and class distinctions and hierarchies, sort of buttressing the whole modernizing program and modernity in general. So in my final chapter then, I interrogate these convergences in ways that artists sort of overcome them or subvert them, thinking about Farhad's collaboration with weavers, and specifically Habibadullah, who was still alive and was able to tell me about some of her interpretations of tapestries that she imagined and wove, and about their process. And it made me think of together how these women, Farhadullah and the others, had a form of metis, and I turned to a feminist theorist, Anne Berggren, who wrote a book called Weaving Penelope, and talked about a weaver's transformative intelligence. And so I then want to kind of end and conclude with an image that's not my book, because it was obviously happened afterwards, but to say that artists who engaged with social uplift appropriated and transformed the mechanisms by which artistic categories and relationships had functioned in colonial Tunisia, in the art school, in the private enterprises, in the galleries, and that by exploring these relationships, my book can recuperate a marginalized history of artists and feminized art forms that really, I think, merit further attention. And so in 2022, I unfortunately didn't see this, but a friend in the audience sent me this photograph. Safia Farhat was the focus of one of Cecilia Alemani's curatorial interventions to kind of pay homage to overlooked women artists as well as art forms. And so with that, I will take a drink of water, and thank you for your patience and your interest in this project. And I appreciate your staying to listen to the conversation and to asking any questions. I feel like I only got to cover just a smidgen of the book, but I will share some copies around, so if you want to see some of the images that I didn't have an opportunity to talk about, also some of the artists who I didn't focus on in the presentation, but who have a greater appearance in the book, like Zubair Turki and Jacques Arnaud and Pierre Bouchel, etc. So thank you very much.
Jessica is a fluent French speaker, and I think for the Q&A after we can open the questions and ask people to ask questions in whichever language they want. Perhaps for my first comment, I will refer back to the full title of your book, Decorative Arts of the Tunisian École, Fabrication of Modernism, Gender and Power. And really at the core of your project lies a commitment to draw connections between those three elements, so modernism, gender and power. And you manage, in fact, to thoroughly give us a very accurate picture of those entanglements, the entanglements of artistic life with political life. And Safia Farhat comes to occupy a central part in your research. You dedicate a whole chapter to her in the book. Safia Farhat, as many know, was not only a prolific artist, she was the director of the School of Fine Arts, supervisors of the ateliers of the Office of l'Artisanat. She was the chief editor of Faiza's magazine, the founder of the Zine Decoration Company, co-founder, wife to a statesman. And you even mention in your book her anecdote with Farhat Hashed, saying how she was very close to the UGTT anti-colonial also actions and witnessed the final moments of Farhat Hashed. So Safia Farhat, as an artist, a political figure, a CEO, therefore really embodies in her life and work these connections between modernism, gender, and power. And I was wondering, how did you become interested in the figure of Safia Farhat and her work? And could you tell us more about her place in your research?
Okay, so thank you very much for that question. And well, I remember the moment in 2006 when I first visited in Tunis. I had a fellowship from Emory where I was doing my doctorate to come and just see what material was there, because in the United States I could find very little about Tunisian modern and contemporary art written in English. And for many reasons I picked Tunis, mostly because I was interested in some of the textiles, but I came for a visit and met Rahma Bourbala, who was at that time the director of Gallery Yahya, and she was extremely generous and kind, and I thank her very much for an introduction to Aisha Filali, because once Rahma started to hear some of my interests. She introduced me to many contemporary artists. I said, I think I'm interested in going down to Jerba and finding some weavings and textiles. And she said, I think I know an artist whose work might interest you. And she introduced me to Aisha Filali and brought me to Rades. And after that, I picked up the biography of Safiya Farhat that was written by Aisha Filali, and then engaged in conversations with her over the years and started to look at her work. After a couple of years, I had to finish my coursework and take my PhD exams. I wrote a proposal for a Fulbright fellowship to come to Tunis for a year and to study her work, and then to study the works of the other École de Tunis artists. And so it really, started in 2006, and I found that there was a great interest in her and the other artists with whom she worked, like Abdelaziz Gorgi, like Zubair Turki. I would present some images and give discussions as a PhD student at conferences or with other art historians, and people were always very, very interested, and so, the ball kind of rolled. And thanks to also the assistance and the generosity of people here, they gave me access to looking at her works and looking to the other works of the artists with whom she worked. I remained and remain interested in her work because I'm wanting her to appear in my second book, which will be about fiber arts from a trans-regional perspective. And so, I could go on and on about the materials that I found interesting in her work, but I also, that said, I want to maintain a balance between kind of, in the book, focusing on her role and sort of her embodiment of so many of the issues that I've been raising, but also not to lose sight of with other artists with whom she was working.
Yeah, and actually, as a matter of fact, in this part you dedicate to Safiya Farhat, we also learn about the first generation of Tunisian women graduates from the School of Fine Arts, and including Fela Kefi that you talked about, Saida Basrour, Nabiha Bahri, Hayed Bounatouf, Delila Biri, Najat Abdelhadi, or Zainab El Haddad, the first Tunisian woman enrolled in the architecture department. And you go over their professional careers, their ties to feminist organizations, and their experience as women in the arts in the first decade of Tunisian independence. And researchers often find it challenging to work on women artists due to a lack of sources. As we know, unfortunately, women are less visible than men in certain historical archives, as they've been less studied by those creating those archives. And I'm therefore curious to know what were the main challenges you had to face to compose those feminine histories, and how did you overcome the lack of sources, if any?
Well, thank you. Well, I think this is one reason why Fela Kefi has been such a generous and amazing resource for me, because she had saved so many of the photo albums, the newspaper clippings from her student days at the art school, original artworks that she created with Gorgi, and has a really good memory and was able to talk about the way, for example, that she worked with Gorgi in his classroom, what the dynamic was like, how much she loved that experience. There were several other women who worked with Safiya Farhat who I spoke with and who showed me a few of their artworks that appear in the book. But it was very difficult. So I had looked to some articles that appeared in the journals Femme and Faiza for the names of the artists, but I really had trouble finding them. I found Fela Kefi, as you know, through a very circuitous route. It was actually, I saw her work for the first time in Dakar, in Senegal, because I had, for my dissertation, I had one chapter that looked at the École de Dakar and the founding of the tapestry atelier there in 1966. Also with the help of Jean Loursat. And she was exhibiting in the first World Black Arts Festival in '66 along with Edgar Nakash. And I became interested in this connection. And so I tried to find her via the internet, and I couldn't, I asked people here, and people knew of her but didn't know where she was or her phone number. And then the Cité de la Culture, where she had been a student, somebody in their library finally responded to an email, and they said, well, we have her phone number. I'll call her on your behalf, and if she wants to talk to you, I'll give her your email address. So she emailed me. And that was my most successful, I think, with the art students from the Beaux-Arts. Others I could not find. Some of the names that you mentioned, Najat.
No, it's Najat Abdelhadi.
Najat Abdelhadi had interesting works that were kind of similar, also in the style of Gorgi. I could not find her. I could not find most of these women.
Okay.
So, I mean, a lot of it's word of mouth. I don't live here, perhaps, but over the years, I really did try. And then with the artisanat, that was even more difficult. The entire period of my doctoral studies here, I never had access to any archives in Denden. I would go frequently and was told there were no archives, or you can't access them, or nobody can help you at that time. Once I got my PhD, and I think the directorship had changed in around 2014, he said, oh, we do have some archives, here's the archivist. And then brought me back to look at some things. It took about a month to get research clearance, and then I had about a week to work with a certain set of materials that I photographed, and that's where I found the names of some women who wove in the artisanat. And so it helped me to understand who some of these artists or aspiring artists were, what their family histories were.
Okay. Beautiful, and it actually links to my next question, because I wanted to ask you about weavers and the loom in your book. So you extensively cover the way that the Bourguibist Women Emancipation Project transformed the position of women and the decorative arts training programs. And indeed, you narrate how artistic training, and more specifically so-called artisanal training, was instrumental in educating women and enrolling them into the developing textile and artisanal industries. And you presented this beautiful quote by Safia Farhad: "In the hands of an embroiderer, advanced education." Could you tell us more about, the role of the loom, weavers, and more broadly textile-related labors in this transformative state-led effort? I know you talk about it in your book, but it would be nice to have an idea about it.
Oh, thank you. So, it started with looking at some of the documents from the colonial period. Well, I mean, it didn't initially. When I wrote my dissertation, I was focused on, okay, I keep seeing these images of women weavers and women laborers when I'm trying to read about what's happening in the period of the 1960s. What do these images suggest? And was looking at the ways in which the image was sort of instrumentalized, and then the ways in which artists themselves were engaging with craft to sort of subvert what they had been told in art schools. So, for example, Ali Belagha and Gorgi, when they had taken art classes, I think it was Belagha who said, when I was in art school, I was told I had no history of arts, that the artisan was not considered art. And so I started looking then at the ways in which the images of women and women weavers at the loom became the subject of efforts really under Jacques Revaux, the Office National de l'Artisanat, that was formerly the Indigenous Arts Office, where the French really tried to take control of the textiles and ceramic industries for economic purposes, but also for this civilizing mission. And so the idea was that the woman weaver, who kind of symbolized the average person because she was, most women in the early 20th century, engaged with fiber art of some sort or wove at the loom at home, among other activities, that this would be a place in which women could sort of be educated and quote-unquote civilized. So it comes from a very diminutive idea in the hands of some French officials. But then it was interesting how some of those relationships got reproduced. So I met in 2014 Ahmed Ben Salah and asked him about the ways in which weavers were kind of integrated into his economic ideas. And he said, you know, every woman knows how to weave. And at that time, what do we do? How do we get some of the women who are past schooling age to become productive members of society? Let's bring them into the artisanat, and many of them already were. And so that's how, you know, I started, you know, I went to primary sources or talked with officials like him, basically, who said these were some of the ideas that were generated. And I'm not suggesting that artists like Safia Farhad or Gorgi or Belagha were echoing the colonialist assumptions, but rather that they are engaging with them and seeking to kind of subvert them or to overcome them, and thinking about negotiations of power within the societies in which they live and work. So I found it to be very complicated, but also very beautiful to see the ways in which they worked with different artists and artisans. And in the book, I use the term artisan to sort of make that differentiation. It's not a term that I necessarily adopt. You know, I'm not trying to take a stance, but rather to use it in the way that makes clear what some of these different levels of social hierarchy were and are.
Okay. I might, it's fascinating, and we can go on. So I'll ask you a last question maybe, and we can open it to the public. In your final chapter, Penelopian Poetics, you brilliantly dwell on the tapestry of Safia Farhat, and more particularly the Ulysse and Penelope series, and propose poetic interpretations of it. In this chapter, we understand the depth of Safia Farhat's practice, one that you claim had the capacity to interweave a variety of readings while simultaneously being ambiguous. And yet, the legacy of this prolific artist, you say, has been the most obscured and contested. Your book proposes to understand the conditions that marginalized certain artists and art forms and endangered certain works of arts, and more particularly those of so-called decorative nature. Could you tell us more about that, maybe as a concluding note?
Sure. Okay, well, when this quote just comes to mind, and with all due respect to my dear dissertation advisor, Sydney Casper, who I loved. She unfortunately died before this book came out. She told me if I wrote a dissertation about weaving, I would be a bartender. And she supported me, but she said, people aren't, this is not modern art, this is going to be very hard for you to make a living, you know, this is not as interesting. And so that just, to me, sort of encapsulates the ways in which, you know, coming from an art history program in the United States, and you're looking at 1950s, 1960s artworks, and you're not looking at sculptural tapestries produced like Eva Hess or Sheila Hicks, but you're looking at that work in Tunis, that might not be seen as artwork that will interest a public enough to publish something to get you a job. And certainly, previously, if one went into MoMA or some of the modern art museums, these were not works that would be put on display. Certainly, I didn't study any of this as an art student. I became interested in issues of gender and fiber. Some of that is my own personal interest because I have a loom and I enjoy weaving and thinking about the ways in which when one sits at the loom, the meditative process that allows you sort of to get out of your mind and to think about the bodily experience and the sensorial experience of weaving. So it's something that has been interesting to me. And then talking to different weavers over the years, both in Tunis and elsewhere, the ways in which this, as a physical process, enables a creative and meditative kind of out-of-body experience, I found to be quite profound. But I think there was something else that I wanted to add, but now I'm I'm sorry.
No problem. I mean, the reason why I asked you this question is because I read also one of the papers you published about the rejection of Safia Farhat, who applied multiple times to be an artist featured in the Lausanne, it was the Lausanne Textile Biennial. I know it's outside of your book, but in your book you kind of lay the ground to explain, why certain forms of art, such as textile art, have been always understudied or overlooked. You say? So that was my question.
No, and I will say, just sort of then as a kind of the segue to the book project I'm working on now, I'm using the Lausanne Biennale archive as the premise for this book. Because I went in 2011 to Lausanne to look for the archival documents of Safia Farhat, and then I asked, there was a folder and it had some beautiful slides, and, her application, she was rejected. And then I asked to see the other artists who had been rejected, because I had a whole weekend there, and then, this was one little file, so I have 3 more days to kill. I'll go look at the other files. And I saw there were artists from many, many other countries in Africa, the Arab world, Southeast Asia, who had also been rejected. And so, tapestry itself is a hybrid form. Some would say, particularly at mid-century. But then those artists who did succeed at doing it, who were based in mainly in Western and Eastern Europe and in North America, a few in South America, they really, I have to say, engaged in a very primitivizing discourse around their work and borrowed from the ideas of ethnic craft and reiterated those tropes in their own textile work. And so I thought that it made it very difficult for artists like Safia Farhat, among others, to sort of overcome some of these biases or these hierarchies that were very firmly set. And I realized there aren't really any other critical histories of tapestry that look at this primitivizing discourse of the 50s, 60s, 70s into the 80s. So.
Thank you so much. I still have some questions, but I would love to leave room for the wide audience, actually, to ask their own questions. Is there a microphone in the audience, or should okay, there is one. So please feel free to go to the microphone, and I will be sitting.
Thank you very much for this book. Really amazing. I would like to ask you, why did you choose specifically this picture, this artwork, as a cover for your book to illustrate it? And how come you heard about Tunisia in the United States, and how? Huh?
Thank you. Okay, this is a wonderful question. So, I actually wanted a different image on the cover of the book. I wanted to use a photograph of a tapestry of Ulysses and Penelope. Of Ulysses and Penelope, one of the tapestries that appear in the 6th chapter by Safia Farhat. The designer chose this one, I think, because of the size and the shape of it. And it was because the other images were more square, and this one was somewhat of a rectangle. But when I saw the cover, I thought it was really stunning and kind of unexpected. And I said, do we have to use this one? Or, and I went with it. And then I liked the fact that it was by Fela Kefiluru, who most people didn't really know. And it maybe suggested that it was not just another book about the École de Tunis, but rather sort of beyond. And so, it was the designer's choice. And I thought when I got the proof of the book, it was beautiful. And I thought it was a very aesthetically beautiful product. So I said, okay. I asked if the Safia Farhat work could go on the back cover, but they did not. So it wasn't a decision that I had personally. You do have to have a give and take with the press. I was able to get 2 subventions to be able to afford the illustrations of the book. One from the College Art Association and one from the University of Kansas. They donated $10,000 to illustrate this book. And first the editor said, we need you to have only 60 images and 20 in color or something like that. And I said, no, I need 120 images and 40, or at least 40 in color. So I negotiated that. How I came to study Tunisia, honestly, that was in graduate school. I wanted to study modern art. I wanted to study textiles. I started looking at some different books about Morocco, about Egypt, about Germany. And like I said, I didn't really find anything in the US at that time on Tunis. So I wrote this small grant to go to Tunisia from the African Studies Institute at my university, and they sent me. And then when I arrived, I just found there was such a rich and exciting scene that even though at that time I did not really speak any French or was studying like Fusha, and couldn't really speak, over the years was able to, I wanted to stay and work here and found so many interesting possibilities for research. And as I said, an interest in the US, so thank you.
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. I found this to be very, very exciting and exhilarating. And I guess my question relates to, well, your book made me think about Clara Porcet, who's working within Mexico and is also working during the same time and is considering modern furniture design within the craft industry, particularly in Mexico. So I guess my question is how does Safia Farhat and perhaps many of the women artists that you also talk about in your book, are they in conversation to a larger international, trans-regional or transnational conversation? It would be curious to think about that. And I was just like, yeah, super curious. So thank you.
Thank you for your question. So absolutely, I think, and that is the subject of the book that I'm working on right now, because she was in conversation with Sheila Hicks, with Jean Lorsat, and is everything okay? So I have been looking at archival documents that show the ways in which these different artists are in conversation, either through exhibitions, through letters, through interventions, such as the United States Intelligence Service had a program for artists. When I talked with Sheila Hicks about why she came to Tunisia, she said, well, I'm a fiber artist. I guess they figured I could go to parties and not offend anybody. And so she, visited the art school. And so the Lausanne Biennales, I think, are one way in which artists were able to kind of converge around a nexus, even if some of them were denied. In Egypt, I found conversations between Ramses Wissa Wassef, who had a tapestry studio outside of Cairo. He was very much interested in what the situation was in Tunisia and different approaches to tapestry here in the 1960s. Etel Adnan, the Lebanese-American French tapestry artist who recently passed away and poet, she came on sabbatical in 1966 to make a film across Tunisia and Egypt, and wrote about this, and was also very close, I believe, with Jacques Marmy. and several others who were moving between Tunisia and Lebanon. So I'm in the middle of sort of tracing some of these correspondences because they were certainly operating in a much wider network. I started to look at that in my dissertation, actually, but because it was very daunting to have a project that would mostly be introducing US audiences to Tunisia, I kind of kept some of that out for a later project.
Honestly, like I have so many questions, but I will choose only two for now. Like from feminism, transracial, and power perspective, I would like to ask you about the involvement and inclusion of rural and different regional Tunisian women artisans in both Tunisian art history and in your book. The influence of rural Tunisian women in your book.
Oh, thank you. So I would say that I was looking at historical traditions or engagement with artists around Kairouan and around Gefsa the most, particularly as those were the regions that were targeted first by the French artisanat and then later under Bourguiba. A number of the tapestry studios were in Gefsa, and some of the Beaux-Arts graduates went down to Gefsa or were involved with design. Certainly a number of artists, including other artists who were very critical of École de Tunis artists, like Neja Mehtawi had artworks that were executed in Gefsa. I did speak with a couple of weavers there, but nobody from that. I was not able to find anyone when I went to Gefsa from that time period. But I did have conversations with Fatma Samet, with who else? Ismail Ben Frej, and people who had gone to different places to work with women who were weaving. So, and then certainly in the archival documents I found, both in Tunisia and in France, material about women working in those areas. But when I went to try to find archives, like in Gefsa, I did not succeed in finding them. I'm sure there are some there, but I was never able to access them in the times I went down there.
Yeah, I think this is leading me to the next questions, like rural women also was missed in the feminism narrative. So I would like to ask you, my second question is like, how much do you think rural women artisans has influenced contemporary artists, such as textile artist Annie Albers and also Sheila Hicks that you mentioned?
Sheila Hicks is a fiber artist. Some of you may know her, some of you might not. She's still alive. She does amazing three-dimensional sculptural works. She was in Tunis. She worked, she has a studio in Paris. She's actually from Nebraska in the United States. She had spent a fair amount of time in Mexico working with women weaving. And, you know, I think her intentions were not quite the same as artists like Safia Farhat, or in Lebanon, Salwa Rouda Shu'er, who was visiting different weaving studios in the 50s in Lebanon as a way of sort of elevating women and craftspeople. And so I think that in the sort of decolonizing context, there was an interest in the uplift of craft, the uplift of women who are engaged with knitting and fiber art and weaving in a way that, quite frankly, was not the case with artists based in North America and in Western Europe. I would argue that in parts of Eastern Europe, there was an interest in fiber art as a way to kind of circumvent communist restrictions on art in the 1950s, and I have been looking into some of that in Poland, and the ways in which artists came at sort of abstraction through that. So I do think that sort of depending on the artist and depending on their position and their politics, you know, their interest and their elevation, or their interest in women, you know, they come from different perspectives. Some might be more appropriating than others, not to name specific names. Yes, I would be glad to speak with you, and if you would like to have the PDF, you can write your email address for me and I'll send it to you, and I do have some copies if you want to look at them. So thank you all for being here on Friday. Merci beaucoup. Merci.